First moved to Rockhampton full-time in 1992. Obviously, had passed through Rockhampton many times. I grew up, or spent part of my life in Mackay, so it always passed through Rockhampton. Knew of Rockhampton well, and then came to Rockhampton in 1992 after my first radio station being down in Traralgon in Victoria. Moved to Rockhampton in 1992, and the first thing I think I really got from Rockhampton was that it still had that country town feel. It was still a small regional town. It was just had that you know. I love, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit down the track, but I still love that originality of small towns. I mean, we've lost that over the years, but the idea of the local stores being local, named after the local celebrities, and you knew who they were, and they were the people behind the counter. And 4RO obviously was the only radio station at the time, only commercial radio station at the time, and it was just great being part of a radio station that had so much strength in town. Obviously, being the only one, you knew that most people were listening to you and involved in what you were doing, and it was just that was great, having the one radio station, and that small town, not mentality, but that small town feel, and still being close to the community, and everyone was tight knit. That was very special. I think, and going back to that last comment, it's the loss of that small town. Obviously we know that, particularly the coast, it's just growing at such an alarming degree, and we don't, as Rockhampton residents, I think we see that slipping away, that small town feel, as we get bigger and bigger. Weber's Retrovision is the one that came to mind. You go, Dougie was the man behind the counter, and that was the store, and it's the same as those Stewarts, and now you wander through a shopping centre, or you wander, and it's just the same store as you'll find in Mackay or Brisbane, or all these big conglomerates that have just taken over those small businesses, and that's a great shame, and that's a great loss. Do you know, I'm going to go back to 2011 and the floods. Natural disasters are the most terrible thing that can happen to a community, but they're also the most incredible thing that can happen to a community, because to watch people come together, to watch streets and neighbourhoods and suburbs and whole towns come together to support people. You think about the 2011 floods, they were terrible, and obviously not the first time or the last time that we've had floods in Rockhampton, but the way that people react and the way people work together, and you see, Depot Hill, people in boats going to get supplies for people and bring the supplies back, and the only house in the neighbourhood that's got power cooking people's food, and barbecues out the front of people's yards. That's incredible. And as I said, natural disasters can have such a shocking impact on communities, and then you see that afterwards or see that during, and you go, it's still that opportunity for a community to come together and show what they're capable of doing. So there's nothing, the community spirit is an amazing thing, and when someone needs help, when someone puts out their hand and says, I really need assistance here, to watch communities come together and help is still the most amazing thing. And to be a part of that through 4RO, to have people contact the radio station and say, this person needs help, we want to raise money for this, or we're trying to do this, or we're trying to build such and such. To watch a community respond. I remember a couple of years ago we did a fundraiser for Legacy, and on this particular Legacy Day, they had a particular investor who was going to match every donation locally, dollar for dollar. And we raised $16,000 that day. That's incredible. Over a course of 4 or 5 hours on air, we raised $16,000. Legacy is such an important organisation. To be able to do that was quite incredible. It is those stores, isn't it? It's wandering down East Street. It's wandering down the mall and seeing all those terrific stores in the mall. And once again, and we are overlapping a little bit, but just that safety. You know, people move to regional areas for the community and the safety, and it breaks your heart that Rockhampton is going through some of the turmoil that is at the moment with youth crime. I mean, we didn't expect that here. I remember watching television shows of America back in the 80s where they had to be metal detectors on the doors of schools as kids went into the schools, and you thought, that's so terrible, you know, leave that in America. Now we're facing the same thing here, and you think about youth crime, and you think about being safe on our streets, and you hear stories about syringes on the sides of roads. That's not Rockhampton. I don't know at what stage we went from Rockhampton being a safe regional community that people loved being part of and where the community was tight-knit to this finding syringes on the streets and youth crime and all these things that we fear and locking your doors because you don't know what's going to happen during the night in cars. But I don't know when the borderline was from one to the other, but certainly we've gone too far this way, and that's horrible. I miss that safe community. I miss that reason that people came to the regionals. I think probably going back to the floods. Can I go back to the floods again? I mean, 2011 was a particularly it was a terrible time once again. Because of the way natural disasters impact communities. But being on the radio at that time, when things like that are happening, is quite remarkable. Because you are the support for people, you're the information for people. You're not only telling people what's open and where you can go to get whatever they need, but you're sharing stories and you're hearing real life. And this is happening in my life right now. It's not Rockhampton based, but a story that immediately comes to mind when I think natural disasters. When I was on air in Mackay one day, we had incredible rainfall. They still believe that this rainfall over 6 hours is a world record. It was 700 mils of rain that they got in a 6 hour period. You could literally see the water rising outside the studios. And I was in air, and I stayed on air right through that. It was 2008. And I stayed on air until the water had subsided. I was on air for 7 or 8 hours. And during that period of time, someone called up and said, it's the anniversary of the 1958 floods. And it just so happened that back in 1958, there was a terrible flood that had come through Mackay and had taken lives. It wiped out whole communities, whole suburbs had disappeared during that time. And after they spoke about the anniversary of the 1958 floods, someone rang up and said, have you ever heard the story about the baby in the floodwater? So what had happened in this 1958 floods, this street that it was virtually washed away, people were climbing up on the top of their houses onto their roofs. And somebody had a newborn baby, and they were climbing up on top of the roof of their house, and they dropped the baby in the floodwater. So the baby goes into the floodwater and goes down to the next house where the person reaches in and grabs the baby out of the floodwater. Incredible. So had that story, and I get goosebumps every time I tell it, because to hear that story on air was amazing. And then that baby who was celebrating her 50th birthday rang up and was telling her story about being the flood baby and what it meant to her through her life. That evolution of that story while you're on air is just amazing. And for people to be able to share that, and as I said, you go back to the 2011 floods, or you go back to cyclones, or you go back to, and to be able to have people share those stories, which is almost a break away from what they're going through at the time, And so it's not just about the information, but it's that community connection. And there's something very special about being that connection to the community at those times. The location more than anything, it's just, I'm going to mention a natural disaster again. It's only, I was living in Rockhampton when Cyclone Larry hit in Innisfail, and I had friends from down south ring up and go, "Are you okay?" It's 800 kilometres away. It's people in Sydney and Melbourne and they have no idea where Rockhampton is. They know it's central Queensland, but for them, a lot of them don't realise how big Queensland is. Central Queensland is Bundaberg to Cairns. And so they do get the location wrong, and I've experienced that myself on a number of occasions. So where's Rockhampton? Isn't that near Brisbane? No. So they definitely get that wrong. But going back to something I said earlier about that community feel, maybe they get that wrong a little bit too now because we've lost it. That safe region. Maybe they get that wrong and come here thinking they get that safety and that and maybe not as much. But mostly they get where we are wrong. It's quite often so where is Rockhampton? Isn't that? No, it's nowhere near there. I got like we talk about that the small town feel and those stores we used to have and the great names. I hope some of those are still remembered in 100 years' time. I hope we still remember that. I mean, who knows what Rockhampton's going to look like in 100 years' time? How big is it going to be? Maybe I go back before to talking about, they ask where Rockhampton is and they say somewhere between Cairns and Brisbane. Maybe we will be one big suburb. We'll just, who knows how big Rockhampton, it'll probably be, Mackay will be a northern suburb of Rockhampton. And Bundaberg could be a southern, Gladstone could be a southern suburb of Rockhampton. I hope we don't lose that. I hope we don't lose our identity. I hope we don't lose Rockhampton and not just Rocky, but the Cap Coast. You get the feeling that one day Yeppoon's just going to be another suburb of Rockhampton, and I hope that doesn't happen. I hope Yeppoon and Emu Park and Rockhampton still in 100 years' time have an identity.